All right, let us begin quickly. You're actually going to start with 2011 Unit 2 Geography Keep examination past paper, Module 2. All right. Now, the first question here is, in fact, question 4, Module 2. All right, as you can see on the upper part of the screen here. You have to define question 4A, part 1, define the term biotechnology. Now, this term is in fact a very significant term. Biotechnology is a concept which involves the use of living organisms. When we say living organisms, we are referring to both plants and animals to propel the development or the alteration of engineering or even applied sciences. All right. This particular concept can actually have a very fundamental impact upon numerous economic activities, inclusive of research, agriculture, and even industrial activities for that matter. All right. Next one quickly. Describe one advantage and one disadvantage of the use of biotechnology. Now, in terms of the advantage associated with biotechnology, we can simply see it can be associated with improved productivity, for instance. In agriculture, right, genetically modified crops can in fact be able to produce more under certain conditions where their resilience, right, or the resilience of that particular crop can in fact be said to be improved as well. Now, one disadvantage associated with biotechnology, human alteration, right, of the natural processes and also at the basic genetic level of organisms can simply produce initial unnoticeable changes, but eventually it can actually manifest into unprecedented scenarios. Human manipulation of organisms can towards a potential intended purpose, maybe perhaps it can yield unknown results. We don't know. All right. As a matter of fact, and this can be, potentially irreversible. All right. Or environmentally impacting. We don't even know what the effects of biotechnology can have because sometimes we can push the limit. We can alter the natural mechanism of things. And this is a very serious thing, as a matter of fact. All right, let's go through quickly. The next question actually looks at B. Study the pie charts in Figure 2, which shows the employment sector and economic development, and answer the questions that follow. Now, students are strongly advised, right, that you pay attention to the diagram that we are seeing on the screen here. Hold on, let me just see if I could actually get all in one shot. I want you to take a minute, all right, everybody. I want you to take a minute and actually look at these graphs. Well, pie charts, sorry. All right, you are seeing least developed LDCs on the left-hand side, the top left-hand side. On the top right-hand side, we are seeing all LDCs. LDC stands for less developed countries. And at the bottom, well, technically left, it is in fact associated with all MDCs or more developed countries. Take a minute and look at the graph. This chart, sorry. All right, so the first one indicated here in the diagram, you can simply see any question. Describe three differences in employment between countries at the various levels of economic development, as shown in the pie charts above. Let's go back. Now, look carefully, all right? Look carefully. We are actually seeing that there is, in fact, a deviation from the dependence upon, agronomic activities. Now, from this particular diagram, these charts you can see here, the least developed countries did in fact have 71% associated with agriculture. All right. With respect to the actual employment sector, was largely hinged upon agriculture as a major economic factor or component. But generally, conceptualizing all LDCs, you realize that that particular value declined by 259%. All right, that meant that some areas paid less attention to agriculture as a major economic activity. Maybe major, but in terms of the actual overall, significance of it, it declined slightly. Now, if we were to compare LDCs to all MDCs, that is where the deviation actually lies. All LDCs tantamount to 59%, all right, where that's employment opportunities derived from agriculture, that sector, whereas only 10% was associated with for those more developed countries in terms of the employment sector itself. All right, that is a very significant thing. That is a major decline. That's a major deviation. All right. So what does that mean? That simply means that the there is no longer a major dependence upon agronomic activities or agriculture in this regard in terms of satiating the needs of the population as it relates to the employment aspect or even as it relates to the economic sector. All right, it depreciated from, if you're looking from one extreme, least developed LECs, to all LECs in general, to even all MDCs for that matter. Now, another point we could actually consider here is that the tertiary sector, all right, is in fact associated with overall expansion, all right, with regards to employment. You understand? This is in fact a new frontier. Look at the tertiary sector. Just remember the tertiary sector is in fact associated with service provision and stuff like that. We are seeing 18% for least developed LECs. We are seeing 24% for all LECs. And we actually seen 56% for all MDCs. So what I'm saying is that the tertiary sector is in fact associated with a progressive expansion, which with movement from the least developed LECs all the way up to all MDCs for that matter. All right. Like I said, it is in fact considered to be a new frontier. Now, thirdly, right, if you look at the chart, let's go through this quickly. It basically highlights the human resources. It highlights the human resources as a criterion that can actually facilitate economic change. You understand? Where services involve much less arduous work, all right, as compared to that of agriculture or industrial activities. What I'm saying here, look at the expansion of the sector, the service sector, which is associated with tertiary economic activities, right? For all MDCs, in relation to all LECs, also in relation to the least developed LECs. All right. The provision of services involve human resources. All right. That's what the reason why I said it highlights the human resources as a major criterion. Well, criteria in this regard. I understand. And as it relates to facilitating, economic expansion and stuff like that. So keep that in mind for me, please. All right. Remember, you can analyze however you wish by simply observing, all right, the charts and the graphs, whatever they produce to you, you just observe it. If you have to take a chance and jot down the little stuff in your scrap page or whatever the case may be, just to keep your numerical values in check, you can simply do so. Feel free. Don't be afraid to do that. All right, you can. All right, let's go through quickly. All right, so part two, which is in fact the last question for question 4, right? Explain 3 ways in which the percentage of a country's population working in the tertiary sector can be an indicator of the stage of economic development reached by that country. All right, by any country for that matter. In your response, include a definition of tertiary sector. Now, students, I think you should start with this. This is the most basic thing for 60 marks. Start with a definition. Your definition base should be very strong. All right, what is the tertiary sector? Well, the tertiary sector actually revolves around tertiary economic activities, and it is in fact associated with what? The provision of services. All right, and it actually highly endorses the use, all right, of human resources. All right. Examples of tertiary economic activities which support the tertiary sector can in fact be associated with, education, all right, counseling services, media coverage and services. All right. You could also have significant medical care. All right. Of transportation services, we have telecommunication services, we have even protective services for that matter. So it is very diverse. But folks, in the world today, right? In the world today, is as a matter of fact, any given country which highly endorses the use of tertiary economic activities, we must bear in mind that these services are relatively in high demand. And if these services are in high demand, hence the expansion of this particular sector is associated with development economically. All right, because this is in fact these are revolving around economic activities, tertiary economic activities to be exact. All right, and you have to remember, if you're talking about economic factors, this is in fact a major parameter as it relates to the development of that country. All right, if the tertiary sector is significantly high, right, you can be making money quickly, All right, and that's a that's a very important thing to keep that in mind for me, please. All right, now, secondly, now there is in fact an essay, right, to highlight this, right? I'll show you that after. Secondly, there is in fact an increase when there is in fact an increase in tertiary economic activity, or perhaps an increase or an expansion in the tertiary sector. We must bear in mind this is in fact associated with decreased demands in agriculture and also industrial activities. Now, why is that? As the population increases, we have to understand that they will simply occupy more land, more range. And as a result of that, there will be less land, less space, less lateral space for that matter, which can be associated with what? With agricultural expansion or even industrial expansion for that matter. So tertiary economic activities is in fact a major way in terms of understanding how money can be made or revenue can be derived to any given nation. All right. Um, by simply employing services that is in great demand. Now, services, all right, this will actually transcend into a third point now. Tertiary economic activities are in fact much more efficient than primary and secondary activities, right, in terms of the acquisition of money. The provision of services does not necessarily mean you will simply be exhausting a resource, a physical or material resource. We have to understand this is also associated with using that of human resources. All right. Now, for example, I'm going to make a nice example before we proceed. If I'm going to compare two persons, one is in fact a tour operator, just okay, for example, a taxi driver or a maxi driver. All right. That particular person can actually work on his own. He can actually derive money very quickly in a relatively short space of time for the day. He is engaged in transportation services. Right? For example, in Trinidad here, when we have to take students to field trips, we will hire a maxi driver and we will carry students in mass to the different locations. He will be making a couple, maybe close to $1,000 plus very quickly in a couple hours. But compare that to someone who is in fact simply like a farmer, right? Who has to wait a couple of months before the crop bear fruit. Well, before the crop bears, right? And basically, that is several weeks, not very months, but several weeks. And that is a significant amount of time. There can be a lot of losses being incurred. All right. Imagine you are making money in several hours or perhaps minutes or within several days, as compared to a farmer who has to start from scratch, scratch, making money over a prolonged period of time, waiting for these crops to simply bear. Obviously, we can see the tertiary sector is in fact much more efficient in terms of the acquisition of money. All right, so keep that in mind for me, please. Now, like I said, there is in fact a question associated with this whole essay, sorry, associated with this whole question. All right, those of you who are in my class, you will actually be privy to it. However, if you would like to request it, just feel free to email me. That's not a problem at all. All right. When you are in fact reading through this particular essay, I want to pay very close attention to the contents. I try to simply highlight some of these points in different paragraphs so it will be easy for you to understand and stuff like that. All right, so keep that in mind for me, please. All right, so the next question here is in fact question 5E. Name four of the stages identified in Butler's tourist life cycle Butler's tourist resort life cycle for 4 marks, right? Now, instead of just showing you, I will show you basically the entire model, all right? And you can pinpoint any one of those stages you choose. Remember, all right, you must be able to revise properly, check through your notes or whatever, double check, triple check if you have to. All right, you can choose any that you wish. You just have to list it and name it, right, for 4 marks. All right, so from here we can actually see this particular concept, right? We have the exploration stage, we have the involvement stage, we have the developmental stage, which transcends to the consolidation stage. But eventually, there is also a stagnation stage, all right? And this has to do with what? The number of tourists, all right, in entering a particular environment with respect to time. All right. The last two stages are, in fact, dependent upon certain conditions, certain factors, as a matter of fact. They can either be a rejuvenation stage where the number of tourists simply picks up once again, or they can simply be a decline stage where the number of tourists simply goes down, it depreciates with respect to time. All right, so keep that in mind for me, please. You can choose any four you wish. All right, so the second part is actually name one more developed country, all right, in the Caribbean that may be found in the fourth stage of Butler's tourist resort life cycle. All right, that would be Barbados. A nice example is Barbados. All right, let's go through quickly. B. Study table 1, which presents data regarding percentage shares of world manufacturing production. All right, and answer the questions that follow. Look at the title carefully. Shares of the world manufacturing production in terms of percentages. All right, let's go through quickly. All right, I want you to take approximately a minute, all right, and look at this particular data set for me. Hang on 1 minute. All right, so look at the table here carefully. Take your minute if you have to. Take your time. Observe the numerical values. All right. Pay attention to what is being said. All right. Look at more developed countries, less developed countries. They actually give you a less developed region. All right. Subcategorizing certain areas. All right. Look at the numerical values. Look at the time frame. 1970 all the way down to an estimated 2005. All right. Now the first question asks, actually the first part of it, well, this is part B, all right? Describe three aspects of the changing pattern, all right, of the manufacturing industry indicated in table 1. This is for 6 marks. Let's go back to the table. All right, folks, I want to pay attention to this quickly, right? So let's look at the first chunk of this particular table. Look at more developed countries versus less developed countries, right? We can see that for more developed countries, within that period of the 35-year period from 1970 to the estimated 2005, we can actually see that for more developed countries, um, there is a progressive decline in terms of the shares as it relates to manufacturing and production and stuff like that. Well, I could see it range from 88, and each year onwards, basically it was subjected to decline with the exception of 1980 and 1990. All right. Generally speaking, from the year 1970 straight down to year 2005, there was a general decline, right, in manufacturing in manufacturing and production. While compared to less developed countries, all right, there was an overall increase. As you can see from the year 1970, it was 12%, and at the end of 2005, it was essentially 29%. All right, so there's a big distinction between both of them. As a matter of fact, contrasting results. All right, in terms of the trends. All right. Now, secondly, actually, we can actually see here that for MDCs and LDCs, all right, look carefully here, right, from the period of 1970 to the year 2005. We're looking at the initial value, which is 1970, to the last value, which is the year 2005. All right, on observing the existing trends that we would have mentioned in the previous point. Now, the actual numerical change from the initial value to the last value was in fact 17% associated with both of them. For instance, look at MDC. It was 88% in 1970, but it dropped to 71% in 2005. That is a 17% decline in terms of the number of the percentage of shares of world manufacturing production. But for LDCs, it was also 17% change from 1970, which was 12%, to 29% in year 2005. That is a 17% change as well. The actual percentage change was numerically the same. However, the actual trend associated with, in terms of the actual directionality of the growth, was there negative, was there positive? We can see LDCs were associated with a positive increase, all right, in terms of the number of shares of world manufacturing production, the percentage, sorry. All right, while MDCs were in fact associated with a 17% change, which is referring specifically to a decline over the period of time. All right, now keep that in mind for me. Now, thirdly, I'd like to highlight the third point, looking at the graph, the table, sorry, the aspect of the table below, looking at less developed regions. Look at this carefully, we can see the greatest, right? The greatest rate of change right, was in fact from the initial period of 1970 to the end period of estimated 2005, it was in fact associated with East Asia, inclusive of China, where it began as 4.2% and it transcended to an estimated 20% in the year 2005. All right, collectively, that overall rate of increase within a 35-year period, that percentage increase actually within a 35-year period was in fact, you can say about 15.8% increase. There are no other less developed country or less developed region, sorry, which actually was in fact anywhere close to that. So East Asia, inclusive of China, was in fact associated with the greatest rate of increase from the initial period to the end period. All right, in comparison to all the other LDC regions. Okay. All right. All right. Now moving into the last question, module 2, right, 2011 paper. All right. Part C. All right. Right. I'm sorry. With reference to one named less developed country outside the Caribbean, write an essay discussing 4 factors which accounted for its industrial change. All right, for 18 marks. Now, folks, when you're writing an essay, I strongly suggest that you have a nice introductory paragraph. You can. It's your choice if you wish. But it actually, if you are writing this in an exam, sometimes it is good to have a nice introductory paragraph. Why? It makes you understand and let the flow of thoughts in terms of your points. It allows you to kind of plan and progressively enter phase by phase into each paragraph. All right, so looking for 4 factors. Okay, let's go through quickly. Now, the country I would like to focus upon is Malaysia. All right, this is not in the Caribbean at all. All right, Malaysia is in the other part of the world, the Eastern Hemisphere to be specific. All right, Malaysia is in fact it is still considered to be less developed country as a matter of fact. But let's go through quickly. All right, so Malaysia in specific, if we are talking about Malaysia, this is actually in the eastern part of the world, right? Eastern hemisphere, to be honest. This is in fact a very unique country, as a matter of fact. It is in relatively close proximity to China, relatively close proximity to Indonesia, and stuff like that. All right, this is in fact a very, very unique location, right? Ease of access is in fact a major, major thing for that matter. Now, this particular country was, in fact, it is still less developed, considered to be developing, I should say. All right, it is not yet considered to be developed. It is not. However, we must bear in mind that there were, in fact, some major strides, right, associated with this particular country. As a matter of fact, in the 1950s, Malaysia was basically dependent largely upon natural resources in terms of the agricultural produce and stuff like that, which was used for exportation. All right. However, we must bear in mind that with progression of time, all right, the government ministers and those at power decided to have a very distinctive revolutionary change. They decided to change the concepts that were in fact associated with Malaysia's productivity, and they had the ambition and the goal, all right, to strive towards development. All right. Now, it was a fervent belief, all right, of the government at that time and the leadership at that particular time, where in the 1980s, right, the early 1980s, like roughly between 1980 to 1981 to 1986, right, it was the belief that they can actually make some significant industrial change, all right, for that particular country, where they focus a lot on small economic investments, all right, as their major foundation. And that major foundation actually set the pillars, right, for greater expansion because it became much more popular. Slowly, well, I should say it wasn't really that slow, but honestly, they significantly were in fact associated with a lot of growth, economic growth, because it was a fervent belief of the leaders at that time that they can be a major producer, all right? They can have a very distinctive name on an international spectrum, all right, and there were many policies that were in fact enacted and that were put in place. All right, so keep that in mind for me. With a strong base, a strong economic foundation, right, you would actually tend to attract other businesses as well. You will tend to attract investments and stuff like that. But that wasn't it. All right, that was just one part of it. Secondly, I like to focus upon the fact that there were in fact liberal investment rules, right? Very transparent to the point where investors, they believe that the mechanism, the drive, right, by the government was in fact a very potential, a very distinctive one, which is associated with potential growth, as a matter of fact. And in this regard, this level of expansion resulted in a pool of different companies coming together. All right. For example, automotive companies, industries and whatnot establishing themselves in Malaysia. Imagine that. All right. Now remember, they had an original goal, original objective for a 2020-year period. For the 2020 that time frame to be of a certain establishment, and they had to make preparations. So the liberal investment rules simply was like a glue. It attracted more and more investors. All right. Apart from the government having a very open mind and trying to transcend from agronomic to more industrial, trying to diversify the economy, they also allowed and facilitated the entry of investors and investments into the country. All right. Now, this was a very important thing. Why is that? Because according to our 2019 statistic, it was indicated that more than $1 trillion, right, was in fact associated with was added, I should say, to their economy, to Malaysia's economy. $1 trillion. Imagine that. Because of a change in policy, because of a difference in view, all right, because of a belief, all right, that was actually upheld. All right. Now remember we spoke about one of those companies, for example, the automotive companies. Perodua was in fact one of those companies. Perodua established itself in 1992 in Malaysia. All right, and it was responsible for producing like close to 1 million vehicles, all right, every year. As a matter of fact, sorry, I think it's a range from 1 million to an estimated 500,000 to an estimated million vehicles per year. All right, which would in fact yield approximately 40 billion ringgit. Ringgit is in fact the currency of Malaysia. And that tantamount to an estimated approximately more than 9 billion US dollars annually. All right, that is a lot of money, as a matter of fact. So you can see for a country like that, yet it is still considered to be developing, but a country to make a major transition like that is an enormous feat. Thirdly, we must bear in mind also there were also tax break incentives. These tax break incentives and given the liberal investment rules and stuff like that, these tax break incentives basically allowed a greater degree of productivity and profitability, right, by the investors, technically because they have to spend less in terms of establishing themselves into Malaysia. All right, they saw it as a major economic opportunity, and that is the reason why many companies decide to flood this particular country, as a matter of fact, in the Eastern Hemisphere. All right. Now, students, this would contribute not only to an increase in the economy, but also it will actually promote, right, employment opportunities, right, for the persons there, for the citizens, all right, for the nationals in that particular country as well. Last but not least, I want to make mention the fact that Malaysia sits in a very ideal location. All right. There is ease of access associated with the northern and certain parts of Asia, like India as well. Even certain parts of Arabia as well, and by extension, we will talk about certain parts of Europe. All right. There is a specific street called Strait of Malacca, which is right here. This is a region where there's a major transshipment route. All right, where many countries in those peripheral areas simply take to actually be guided towards Malaysia, especially for the acquisition of raw materials or produce for that matter, or simply for transporting materials to them. All right, whether it be raw materials or perhaps products. Because remember, in the whole big spectrum, there's importation as well as exportation. And the accessibility associated with Malaysia is, in fact, something which is very paramount, which have contributed to its success in terms of the productivity and the development infrastructurally in that particular country. All right, and as a result, development became a major, well, candidate for growth in Malaysia. This relatively small area here, although it might seem to be very far-fetched, right, it has a unique capabilities, has a unique characteristic, sorry, which allows it to simply progress and to foster a greater degree of economic investment in its shores. All right. It is also close proximity to the different groups of countries known as the all right, once again, I want to remember that these essays, these long essays, like for example, 18 marks and stuff like that, they would in fact be provided in the classroom. If you request it, you can feel free to, you can actually email me. All right. All right, let us begin quickly with 2012 paper. All right, Unit 2, Paper 2, Module 2. All right. All right, so question A, Part 1, define the term organic farming. Now, organic farming is in fact a practice which involves the use of natural fertilizers, typically associated with manure, which are in fact derived from animal waste, or even compost, which is in fact derived from the decomposition of organic materials or the leaves of trees and vegetation. All right, so I'm going to say that again. Organic farming is in fact a concept or a practice, all right, which involves the use of natural fertilizers, inclusive of manure or compost. And it also takes into consideration, well, acceptably sustainable practices, all right, such as crop rotation and, different techniques which are least impacting upon the environment. All right. Organic farming is in fact not in sync with excessive chemical fertilizers, nor, all right, is organic farming associated with blatant monocultural activities. All right, keep that in mind for me, please. Now, state two benefits and two problems associated with organic farming. Now, with respect to the benefits of organic farming, first and foremost, organic farming is in fact associated with loose, unconsolidated medium, all right, natural components, which simply attract soil microorganisms as well as soil macroorganisms or soil organisms in general. All right, and they, by extension, can influence the soil's fertility progressively with time. All right, that is one. Secondly, organic farming, given the fact that we have unconsolidated, loose, natural medium, right? The material which is involved, right, such as manure or even compost, it basically aid, right? They basically aid in terms of moisture as well as nutrients sequestration or storage to that extent. All right, they tend to actually encourage these other organisms, and in doing so, they help to replenish nutrients in the soils. Apart from that, organic components basically facilitate a crumbly structure of soils. So the actual structure is in fact a major component as well. Now, the reason why I'm saying this is because if you were to compare an area which is subjected to organic farming, where you're using manure and stuff like that, the soil will be technically loose, right? Whereas if you were to compare an area which exclusively utilizes chemical fertilizers, then obviously the soils will in fact for that particular location would in fact be very light brown in color. It will be very compact. All right, it is not as crumbly or it is not as loose as those which are associated with organic farming. Now, two problems associated with organic farming is in fact associated with, well, is such say, I'm sorry, my grammatical errors here today. All right. Organic farming practices two problems. I can simply say that one is that it can be relatively bulky. All right. Transporting manure or compost from one area to the next can be relatively bulky. All right. And the application can be a little bit time consuming. All right. Now, secondly, organic farming, given the fact that it encourages organisms, sometimes pests, all right, can in fact be encouraged. And by extension, when there are pests, there can potentially be diseases, right, which can in fact be associated as well. All right, so soil pests can actually be encouraged in a particular area where the organic material is in fact relatively rich. Okay, just keep that in mind for me, please. Let's go through. Now, part B. Study table 1 shows tourist arrival in the Caribbean by main markets for 2006 and answer the questions that follow. All right, I want you to look carefully at the diagram here. All right, the actual chart. All right, I'm just going to go up a little bit. Take 1 minute and look at the diagram. We are seeing, not the diagram, sorry, the table. My bad. I really apologize for the errors there, all right? But table. We are seeing tourist arrival in the Caribbean by main market for the year 2006. Good. We are seeing destination. We are seeing the tourists which are in fact arriving from the US, Canada, Europe, and other. Okay, so take 1 minute, look at that particular table for me quickly. The question goes on to ask which destination received the largest number of tourists. That will actually be Dominican Republic. If you really look at it, all right, this is in fact out of the four numerical values that they have, um, there are in fact two which is associated with 7 digits, to be honest. All right, that's a lot. Good. So Dominican Republic. Now, which market provided the largest number of tourists? When they are asking for markets students, we are referring to the area to which the actual tourists are in fact coming from. Let's look at the graph again. The table, sorry. From the information here, we can see that the United States, right, is in fact associated with the largest the market. It is in fact the largest market where tourists, the majority of tourists are actually coming from. All right, state a destination that had more tourist arrivals from Europe than from the United States. All right, once again, this is United States here, and this one here is associated Europe, where you actually had more tourist arrival from Europe than the United States. Now you can see there are two actual values. We have Europe. I'm sorry, we have Barbados, where the amount of tourists which came from Europe was in fact 240,923, whereas the United States has actually much less. Those that came from the United States was in fact a lot less in terms of number. All right, 130,767. There's another answer that you can actually use. We are seeing here for Dominican Republic, right, 1,425,922 came from Europe, whereas for United States, the amount that came from the United States was in fact 1,992,317. All right, again, 1,092,317. So another answer for this question could actually be Dominican Republic. All right, let's go through quickly. Now, which destination, part 4, which destination had more tourist arrivals from other markets than from Canada and the United States combined? All right, the answer here would actually be St. Vincent and the Grenadines. All right, why? Because 40,331 came from the other locations, whereas the United States and Canada was associated with 20,529 and 6,542 respectively. All right, so keep that in mind for please. The answer would in fact be St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Now, folks, we have to understand, right? These areas are essentially regarded as developed nations, all right? And these developed nations, as such, they would have a greater degree of purchasing power in general, which is per capita, all right, in comparison to many other parts of the world. Hence the reason why they have the means, right, the economic means and the financial means, simply to travel to the Caribbean, all right, especially for vacation purposes or whatever the case may be. All right, that's one. Now, secondly, these countries like the US, Canada, as well as Europe, they experience what we call differences in climatic change. I'm sorry, seasonal changes. All right, they exist generally within temperate regions. And during those seasonal changes, they tend to exit the cool environments and they set to come towards the warm tropical environments as an escape. All right. And this is one of the reasons why they come to embrace the climatic conditions of the Caribbean region. Okay. Another very important reason is that the United States of America, USA, Canada, Europe, all of them essentially, right, is in fact associated with large areas, large land masses. And these large land masses, all right, would in fact have a large number when it comes to the population number in comparison to the Caribbean islands, which are relatively small in geographical size. So there will be a great influx of persons entering the Caribbean, sorry, all right, in an attempt to bask in the ambience, all right, to embrace the environmental conditions, the warmth, all right, in these Caribbean regions, as a matter of fact. So those markets, for example, the United States, Canada, as well as Europe, and other nations as well, they encompass large population numbers in relatively large geographical ranges. All right, now the last question for this particular, well, question right, is in fact part C. The last part is this. Discuss two ways in which multinational corporations have influenced change in industrial development in major industrial regions in more developed countries. Include a clear definition of MNCs. Now, folks, always in a question like this, it is advisable, right? There is, in fact, an S-type question which is available in the classroom. If you would like to get a copy of this, feel free to let me know. You can actually email me. That's not a problem at all. All right. In terms of a better understanding of this particular question, for 12 marks, you should have a proper structure. And when I say structure, I expect you all to simply have an introductory paragraph. And in that introductory paragraph, you have to mention certain clues. For instance, all right, what is a proper definition for MNCs or multinational corporations? Define that. And you can actually give a gist, or you could perhaps include the 2 points, which are in fact associated with the influence of these particular MNCs, right? And how they have in fact influenced change in the development of major industrial regions, all right, in more developed countries. All right, so let's go through quickly. Now, with respect to MNCs, right? An MNC, right, or if I were to generalize by saying MNCs, right, or multinational corporations, all right, you can actually make it plural or singular, it's up to you. Now, I would like to go singular for a minute. Now, a multinational corporation is in fact one which is worldwide in recognition, all right, that has several or perhaps multiple subsidiaries or general production areas, all right, in 2 or maybe even more countries, which relates to the provision of goods and services. All right, multinational corporations. Now, folks, what we must understand is that these multinational corporations are essentially, their headquarters are essentially stationed in the developed nations. All right. Their subsidiaries to which they will provide and extract or manipulate or whatever in terms of the resource of the environment. Most of the times they will technically be that would actually technically be in the less developed countries or developing countries. But their headquarters are technically stationed in the in the more developed countries. All right, so keep that in mind for me, please. All right, now first and foremost, you have to understand that these multinational corporations will actually facilitate the infrastructural expansion and development of the more developed country. Now, if you were to compare more developed countries to that of less developed countries or developing countries, you should appreciate that more developed countries essentially has a greater degree and in terms of the investment associated or directed towards infrastructure. Their infrastructure development is said to be highly pronounced. All right. And in doing so, being the motherland, right, for these multinational corporations, all right, they would essentially ensure that there is in fact a very distinctive outlook. All right. The physical outlook and the level of development would simply attract investors, all right, into the environment, even though it is already developed. Right? It will be a major hub, right? Many persons will gravitate towards areas like that, especially if the infrastructure is in fact relatively sync, or I should say relatively sound for that matter. All right. Now, in talking about the infrastructure of the environment, we should, of these particular areas, we should also take into consideration that the the level, right, to which activities and services, right, are in fact chronologically aligned or are exhibited in these particular areas, it is said to be highly profound. All right. Now, folks, when we're actually talking about the level of development, we must also take in consideration not only infrastructure or economic, but we must bear in mind human resource. And it is actually important cultural approach, which involves the stimulation of human resource in developing countries. Sorry, in developed countries, more developed countries, because this will actually be a notch ahead, right, in terms of ethics, work ethics, as well as in terms of the behavior and the training and the expertise of persons in any given form, which is actually characteristically found in a particular environment. All right, so this is also a major factor, all right, as it relates to development. Development is just not industrial development in this regard is not only infrastructural. You must have that human resource present, right, which can actually be very much accountable, All right, so keep that in mind for me, please. All right, continuing quickly to question number 5. All right, study figure 4, which shows irrigation with poor drainage in a tropical area, and answer the questions that follow. Look carefully at the diagram for an estimated 1 minute. All right, pay attention, look at the actual symbols, look at the tables, everything. Now, this is irrigation with poor drainage in a tropical environment. You are seeing here, in fact, process P and also process Q. All right, you are seeing a subsoil waterlogged environment, which is essentially here. You are seeing the water table 2 on 1, and we are also seeing the irrigated water. And then you have a process P, and there's a crust of salt on the surface of the land. Now, here it is. They ask us here to state the processes occurring at P and at Q. Now, folks, when we are looking at P, to have the crust of salt on the surface of the land, P will be indicative of evaporation. All right, because high level of evaporation on the surface of the land would actually tantamount to the remaining salt, all right, to settle on the surface of the land. It wouldn't be evaporated as well. It will actually crystallize and settle on the surface of the land. So P is essentially associated with evaporation. That is the process. Now Q, on the other hand, Q is in fact a process, an upward movement. Now, given the fact that you have an upward movement of subsoil water, all right, which is technically poorly drained, all right, that upward movement is in fact associated with capillary action, all right, capillary action. And keep that in mind for me, please. All right, the reason is because there is, in fact, a lot of evaporation taking place on the surface of the land, and there will be a suction or a upward force, basically, that will actually draw moisture further to the surface of the landmass itself from an area of high concentration. And the area of high concentration is essentially subsoil region. So that moisture will simply transcend further up. It will actually carry with it dissolved minerals and salts. Hence the reason why the top of the irrigated region, the top of the diagram here has salt crystals. So Q is what we call capillary action, or in some instances, the capillarity. All right, let's go through quickly. Now, describe the effects of these two processes on agriculture. Now, first and foremost, um, the effects of high evaporation rates. All right, high evaporation rates is in fact associated with moisture deficits, especially in certain parts or a certain section of the soil. This can actually contribute to surface cracks to develop on the ground itself, and also the remaining salt crystals, all right, would actually settle on the surface of the land. All right. It actually depends upon the concentration of the salt that exists, and also depends upon the initial amount of water that actually exists in the first place. But process P is high evaporation rates, and this can contribute to moisture deficits, especially within the soil column. All right. When evaporation rates exceed precipitation rates, there can in fact be increases in salt crystals on the surface and also in the subsurface of soils. Now, with respect to the process Q, all right, process Q can actually contribute to soil salinization. All right, process Q is capillary action, but eventually, if evapotranspiration exceeds precipitation and there's a the greater upward movement of moisture, eventually that moisture will eventually evaporate as it reaches closer to the surface of the earth. And in doing so, the same salt crystals that were in fact derived within the soil waterlogged environment, the subsoil regions, that will be brought closer to the surface of the ground, eventually increasing the soil saline content. All right, thereby contributing to soil salinization. Now, part B here simply asks us here to distinguish between the term tertiary economic activity and quaternary economic activities. Now, students, remember, bear in mind for me, tertiary economic activities are in fact those which are associated with the provision of services in an attempt to acquire revenue, all right, on a national level, or even money on an individual level. Tertiary economic activities can in fact include service-oriented activities such as telecommunication, we have transport services, we have protective services, we have media coverage, we have education, we have tourism. You understand what I'm saying? Now, quaternary economic activities, these are in fact associated with research-oriented initiatives, right, which can essentially, in the long term, or in the near future can be pivotal in terms of developing much more efficient means to which activities can in fact be executed. All right. Quaternary economic activities can, in fact, be very important in the long term. Why? Because research oriented initiatives thereby encourage and improve the efficiency to which work can, in fact, be executed. Any task can, in fact, be executed. All right. Medicinal research, we could also have research with respect to, environmental behavior and stuff like that. All of these can actually fall within the category of quaternary economic activities. And there is, in fact, economic value attached to it because nations can actually save money, especially if they invest heavily in research in the long term, right? Because sustainability is in fact a progressive concept, all right? It is something which is very noteworthy and can actually tantamount to a lot of rewards in the long term, all right? So let's go through quickly. Now, C. Governments in the Caribbean encourage the development of manufacturing industries. Write an essay to support the statement above. Include three benefits and three challenges of this encouragement. Now, I would like to begin with an introductory paragraph by saying that Caribbean governments are in fact, Caribbean regions, to be honest, are in fact what we call small island developing states. Right? They are not developed. As a matter of fact, they are still developing. All right? They are not developed as a matter of fact. And in doing so, in this quest to gravitate or reach to that particular level which is considered to be developed, that is the quest these Caribbean countries strive for, they will tend to maximize in terms of their productivity. They will tend to diversify. They will also tend to become much more industrialized. And in doing so, their processing, their manufacturing initiatives will be much more pronounced progressively with time in an attempt to also be competitive either on a regional or even on an international level. All right. So let's go through quickly. Now, to begin with, we have to understand that secondary economic activities are in fact associated with, manufacturing processes and stuff like that. And this would essentially be pivotal as it relates to the encouragement of economic growth. Because once you have much more, Caribbean countries will try to be economically advantageous, all right, in comparison to other countries, because that will actually grant them a greater degree of competitive edge. And in doing so, they will tend to invest heavily in terms of manufacturing and processing, all right, primarily to have a greater degree and a greater leverage on an economic level, right, which will tantamount to more revenue, more earnings. Because if the GDP of a nation is in fact said to be relatively high, that means ideally, the wealth can be potentially distributed across the board, where each person might actually have a greater degree of purchasing power. Now, secondly, Caribbean countries can also try to acquire a greater degree of recognition. And that is actually something which is very, very important because if you are highly recognized, given the fact that you are a major producing country on a regional or perhaps an international level, right, that can actually give you a stance which can simply be productive in the long term and over a successive period of time. All right, generations can benefit from this particular concept, right, where recognition can actually lead to much more investments. All right, so we actually mentioned Trinidad was considered to be, like the quote unquote the Americas of the Caribbean in the 1990s, right, and even prior because we had a lot of resources given a small island, especially on the western part, the western hemisphere. Now, thirdly, I would like to make mention of the fact that um, improvement in the secondary economic activities or industrial activities and manufacturing processes can simply tantamount to an improvement and an increase, right, in employment opportunities. And if the society benefits from improvement in employment opportunities, that simply means you could actually be acquiring a lot more money, right? The country itself can in fact be socially stable, economically stable, and in doing so, can actually be a force to be reckoned with in relation to economic competition on a regional or perhaps an international scale. All right, that is actually something which is very important. All right, as of right now, we know for sure Guyana is in fact a lot more productive. All right, in terms of oil and gas. All right, than Trinidad as and right now. Right, they basically possess a lot more reserves than us. right now, but in the past, all right, our level of development and activities were in fact highly pronounced. Anyway, there are in fact certain challenges, and first and foremost, for industrial activities to simply be very prolific, I must understand that this would require a continuous level of consumption of raw materials. All right, so raw materials need to be continuously present and utilized and consumed. All right, in an attempt to ensure that manufacturing processes continue, not only for the markets, but for the overall, all right, development of that particular industry, whichever industry it may be. That is in fact a very important factor, because if the raw materials, or the supply of the raw materials are in fact limited, whether it be a year from now, whether it be a short period of time from now, or even of a long term, that will transcend into decline or reduction in terms of productivity. We don't want to have that. Okay, now with respect to competition, competition is in fact a very significant thing, right? Because although competition can actually be good, but at the same time, if the competition is in fact too stiff, right, a country can simply be outcompeted, especially if they are vying, all right, against larger producing countries, all right. So there can in fact be significant territorial, regional, perhaps international competition. As a matter of fact, right now, in terms of natural gas and even oil production, we know for sure our neighboring Caribbean country, right, which is Guyana, which is not an island, though. It is not an island, but it's a country, a Caribbean country, regarded as a Caribbean country. All right. That particular country is in fact producing a lot more than us. All right. And in terms of our productivity, it can't really match theirs at this point in time. All right. We must also bear in mind that for infrastructural development to become productive, especially given the fact that you have existing raw materials, which is in relatively stable or perhaps consistent supply, there will be need for expansion. All right. But the problem with Caribbean islands, all right, specifically islands, especially small, those which are relatively small islands or those small island developing states, which technically encompass all Caribbean islands as a matter of fact, we must understand that the lateral space is in fact a major hindrance or limitation to the infrastructural development or the industrial expansion. And that's a very serious thing for students, because in an institute like that, all right, we cannot say we're going to compete against a country like China. China has a large geographical range. We can never compete with that, especially if we were to compare Trinidad to that particular country. In terms of food production, no. But we don't want industrial here. In terms of, say, processing of products and the manufactured products, we cannot compete with them. They simply satiate the needs of the huge markets of the world. Given our limitation, which is geographical space and range, and lateral space, that is, we are limited. We are hindered in terms of our output. All right, so I hope this is actually beneficial. This particular essay, there's a lot more to it, but those of you who are in class, you'll be able to have access to it. Anyone interested in getting it, just feel free to let me know. Email me if you wish. All right, students, so keep good. Keep bye. Bye-bye. This is essentially the last question in 2012 Module 2 paper. Paper 2, that is.